Hey guys, and welcome to 6.1, the Southern Economy, Culture, and Slavery. Make sure you have out everything you need to take your Cornell notes, highlighters, paper, something to write with. All right, and at any point, I'm going to fast for you. Don't forget, you can always pause and finish up your notes or, rewind and listen to something again if you need to before you move on. At this point, hopefully you have your title on your slide. This is part 1 to this lecture of 6.1. All right, so if you're not ready yet, push pause because here we go. All right, Q1, life, blah, blah, slave life. Write it down, highlight it yellow on the right-hand side of your Cornell notes. Okay, so slave life. This is not the first time this year we have discussed slavery. We looked at slavery along the way at several points during this school year, especially at the beginning, way back when colonies were around before we had the United States. There was already slavery coming into North America. Okay, by the time we get to the eve of the Civil War in the early and mid 1800s, slavery has definitely become a booming business. As you guys know, northern states had one by one really outlawed slavery in almost all of the North. Slavery was never widely practiced there. They didn't have enough farmland for large plantations, which are really labor intensive. And the North had a lot more immigrants settling there. That were willing to work for low pay and different types of jobs and stuff that just didn't lend itself to having slavery be a big part of their economy. So the South and the southern states are really the area that's going to have a lot of that slave population. And by the time you get to the eve of the Civil War, the only place really in the United States that has a slave population. Okay, so something to understand about the South is that they produce quite a bit of the world's cotton supply at this time. And you guys, if you think about cotton, you know it's in a lot of things, right? So cotton is a big cash crop for the South. It's very labor intensive. And in the South, we produce at that time about half of the world's supply of cotton. And so, of course, being labor intensive, the South needs a lot of slaves to grow that cotton. Slaves, you have to understand, guys, remember they are property. They are not treated with equal rights as a person. So outside of just facing racism and not having equality to whites or upper class citizens in the South, they weren't even treated as human a lot of the time. They were treated as investments that could be bought or sold. They could be gifted as presents. They could be, passed down in a will from one member of a family to another. They're property. Okay, a little bit about slave life. They work 6 days a week typically, up to 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. If you were pregnant, if you were disabled, if you were elderly, didn't matter. You were out there working the fields or working as a house slave. Additionally, even kids worked. So people as young as 3 years old were forced into labor of some sort as a slave. Most slaves would work out in the field, and they were some sort of field slave. A lot of times they would choose lighter complected African Americans to be the house slaves. Because they felt they were more visually appealing, being closer to white-skinned. Super racist, I know, but that was the way they thought about it. And there were also some house slaves, but majority of them were manual labor workers out in the fields. Okay, so proper nutrition, not a thing. Okay, they don't have vitamins and they're not feeding them properly, which was really not a way to punish them. These are investments that cost a lot of money, remember? So it was more about just not understanding health and dietary guidelines to stay healthy. So unfortunately, there were a lot of babies that would die before their first birthday for Black and white communities, but especially amongst Black communities with less resources and enslaved communities. And a lot of kids wouldn't live to see their 10th birthday. So death rates of children were fairly high, and one of the reasons why people had such large families is because you didn't know how many of your kids would actually make it to adulthood. All right, if you're not ready, draw a line. Or if you're not ready, push pause, because we're moving on. So draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. And here we go. for question number 2. Remember, I'm not going to tell you your left-hand side questions on these notes, guys. You're going to make them up. You are smart. You can do it. Okay? Before we move on to Q2, here's just a look at the southern states. They are practicing slavery. You can see from the chart cotton production going up, and along with cotton production going up, that means slavery is going up, right? And so especially in the states with yellow that have cotton growing areas in them, the slave populations there would be greater than in areas where they were not growing cotton. Okay. All right, there's video clips. I'm not going to show them to you here. You guys kind of know the routine. I will offer this up on the website for you to look at separately and click on links. Do you have to watch them all? Heck no. Should you watch at least a couple? I would. Okay, there's plenty there to choose from that can give you a little bit more of the skinny inside scoop of what's happening with slavery at this time in plantation life. To check those out. Okay. Q2, keeping control. Write it down, highlight it yellow on the right-hand side of your notes. All right, how are we keeping control? You see a picture in that top right-hand corner, guys, very famous slave picture of what whipping, repeated whipping, or severe whipping can do to you. Sometimes they would use whips with nothing attached. Sometimes they would put nails or little pieces of glass or spikes on the straps of leather on the whip, and so it would tear the skin even more as it would go into your flesh as it's getting pulled out and cause severe damage. You get enough scar tissue built up in things, and that would super mess your back up for your entire life. So it wasn't even just visually. Obviously, there's a scar in the aftermath. It would cause physical problems for you the rest of your life after a very severe whipping like that. Okay, so keeping control. If you look at the population dynamics of the South on the eve of the Civil War, there's a lot of areas in the South where blacks absolutely outnumber whites. So how the heck are the whites who are outnumbered keeping control? They did it through fear factor, really. Okay, if you fell out of line, if you did something wrong, you were punished, and you were punished publicly, and you were punished brutally and swiftly in front of other slaves to send the message that this is what happens to you if you misbehave. They also had a group of rules called slave codes, which were in essence laws about slavery on how to keep control of the enslaved people within the South. For example, you were not allowed, it was against the law by penalty of jail time, fines, getting beat up by fellow society members, to teach slaves to read. An educated slave had possibly an easier time rebelling, and they don't want rebelling, right? That causes death and destruction. They look at them as property and investments, so they're supposed to stay in line. So you were not allowed to be educated, to know how to read or write or get any sort of education as a slave. Do some slaves have owners who break the rules and teach them reading and writing? Yes, that did happen. Remember, while as a whole, slaves are not treated well, and slavery is absolutely a travesty and a dark mark on our country's history, there are slave owners who were nice to their slaves. Now, they're still slaves, okay? So there's still something wrong with that picture, but there were people who were treated more like family and were given better provisions and housing and were given education and stuff. That did happen. However, most slaves, no reading, no writing, that kind of thing. Okay, they're treated as legal possessions. Remember that. You can pass them on. You can give them as gifts. Slaves were not allowed to own weapons or have weapons on their person without permission from their owners. They were not allowed to meet in a group, okay, unless you had a white person present. Because if you're meeting in a group, what are you talking about? Are you possibly trying to figure out how to rebel, right? If you were accused of something in court, you could not give testimony against a white person because Black people were seen as untrustworthy and property, not as people, so they didn't have the right to testify in court. You weren't allowed to marry, go to the bathroom, travel, do anything really without your owner's permission. It's very common to break families apart for financial gain or as punishment. You misbehave, I'm going to sell your children and you'll never see them again, right? So how do very few white people in comparison to the population of slaves keep control of the African Americans? It's through fear and through these slave codes that really helped them to keep control of the slave population. There are some laws on the books that actually did protect slaves in regards to being sexually abused or by being too harshly beaten or killed. But those were kind of things that were on the books and no white people followed them. So they were there, but everyone just ignored those laws and treated the slaves the way that they wanted to. Okay, so even if you were somebody who didn't agree with some of this stuff as a white person, you have to understand you'd be under enormous stress and pressure from your other Southern neighbors to fall in line. So even as a white person, if you tried to rally for some slave rights, you might find yourself with a noose around your neck and being strung up in a tree because you were a threat to the Southern way of life. Okay, so it's all about the fear factor. Give yourself a left-hand side question, highlight anything that was super duper very important, and draw a line underneath everything you just wrote. Okay, if you need more time, push pause because here we go. All right, there's a video clip which you can view on your own if you wish. Okay, when you get to the video clip part of this. All right, Q3, African American culture. Write it down, highlight it yellow. All right, so what the heck did you do to have some semblance of happiness in your life as an African American slave, especially if you had a really nasty master? Like, what is your purpose for living, right? Like, what makes the day worth it? Culture in slave African American America is very much entrenched in family, religion, and music. Very important. A lot of music genres we have now stem out of music created by slaves during this period of time in America. Jazz, hip hop, rap, some types of rock and reggae and all kinds of things. Even some versions of pops and of pop music and stuff have roots and foundations in the types of music that was created during this time by slaves. Family, super important. And family was who you made it, because again, you might have your wife or your husband or your kids or whoever sold off and you might never see them again. So if you actually had blood relatives, you were lucky. But family was who you made it to be. So your fellow slaves became your family and your community, even if you didn't have blood relation to them. Okay, so that became very important. Also, religion. It became kind of this mix of West African religions that were mostly polytheistic or Islamic, okay, and them coming over and blending with Christianity that was really popular at this time with white Southern culture. Okay, over time, the more generations you get into slavery, the more and more the African beliefs kind of start ebbing away, and the stronger you can see Christianity coming through with the slave community. But it was a blend of the two. If you had me for 7th grade, you might remember us going over Anansi stories. Those made their way, okay, kind of like fables, West African fables, right? Anansi stories made their way over with the slaves, and they from there turned into Brer Rabbit stories. And you guys have maybe seen like Splash Mountain at Disneyland that's based off of Brer Rabbit. There's a Disney movie called Song of the South that has Brer Rabbit in it. Brer Rabbit's a book and cartoons and stuff you can find at Barnes & Noble and on TV sometimes. And eventually that ended up turning into Bugs Bunny. Okay, so all these things kind of come together in our culture. But oral tradition storytelling was very important because, again, they don't know how to read for the most part, right? It's illegal. So storytelling, music, dancing, and, you know, getting together in their little village, all the shacks that would be lined up with all the slave homes during their off time, which wasn't very often, but, you know, they did have it. Having that together. Soul food, something still big in Black culture and a lot of Black communities, is soul food, things that are easy and cheap to make. Really had a special place in a lot of families' hearts and with their traditions and things they could get their hands on that were easy and cheap. But still yummy, like cornbread and fried chicken and all kinds of yummy stuff. All right, so this is going to wrap up for us part 1 of your guys' video for 6.1 here. So meet me for part 2 through the Flipped Classroom page. See ya in a minute.